everyone, it's Dr. Porras, Precious Porras, she, hers, and today I'm reading to you from Passing. I am outside, so I apologize for this ridiculous looking hair and the fact that you might see my dog. So I also, I'm going to be honest, I'm a few minutes late because I couldn't figure out how to do Instagram Live, and so I feel really old right now. I'm a little shaken because I was like, what am I doing wrong? Anyways, also my internet is being weird, so sorry if I cut out. For this series, and I want to thank Megan Boulong for putting this together, I opted to read Passing by Nella Larsen. An audience, I'm going to be really honest with you. I read this book a couple of years ago, and I thoroughly enjoyed it a couple of years ago, and this time around when I was rereading for preparing for this session, not my favorite book anymore. And Nella Larsen is a brilliant artist, I think, who was ahead of her time. But this, I don't know, this time around, I think when you read books, the context of your daily life in which you're situated just sets you in a different place to prepare for something a little bit different. And so I think maybe whatever I had going on back then when I really enjoyed the book the first time, it's just, yeah, there goes my internet. Also gonna apologize for my dog. All right, disconnected from my Wi-Fi and hoping that this works a little bit better this time around. So thanks to the folks who have joined, and again, apologies if you hear my dog in the background. She wants to play fetch. She's not really interested in this book that we're reading, that I've read. So as I was saying, Nella Larsen is a brilliant artist who I think was ahead of her time. Look, y'all, I'm on the struggle shuttle right now. I'm trying to pull up my notes because I also thought you could do Instagram Live from your laptop, and you cannot. And I was going to read my notes off my phone, so now I've got my notes pulled up on my laptop, and I've got my phone going. So let's try this one more time. Really struggle shuttle today. But the book is set in the 1920s, and it's a fiction book, but sort of it is also based on her life. And the book is about really two women, Irene and Claire, who are light, and they're black women who are light enough to pass. And if you're not familiar with the concept of passing, it generally refers to African American folks, could also be other folks of color, whose skin and features are light enough for them to be considered white. And so in the book, and it's set over the course of 2 years, both Claire and Irene are light-skinned enough to pass. Irene is set herself such that she marries someone who's black, and she lives in her black community, but Claire is trying to pass as white and lives to a white man who doesn't know that she is black. And so the story talks about that and highlights some of the things that the women attempt to do in order to maintain that lifestyle. Irene keeping Claire's secret for her, and Claire trying to maintain that secret, but Claire ultimately decides that she really wants to connect back to her community. And I think that might have been what resonated with me before, was that desire to connect to your community. As someone who grew up black, biracial, I'm a black biracial woman, but as someone who grew up with my white family, I definitely long for a connection to my black community. And my story doesn't really resonate with Claire's or Irene's. I don't think I've been able to pass. I'm never read as white, to my knowledge. So, but that desire to connect with community and long for that community, especially when I've been socialized white, I think when we are people of color and we are surrounded by whiteness, and I'm only speaking from my experience, but being surrounded by whiteness and wanting that connection to black community, that's something that I could identify with. And I spent a lot of time in my adult life trying to unpack and unlearn a lot of the things that I learned being socialized white. So that might have been why this book resonated with me before, and less so now as I'm older, and my experience in my exploration of my racial identity is different. And so I'm going to read some highlights from the book. Content warning, the book does use racial slurs, and so you'll hear some racial slurs as I read through the book. And I use them because I think in particular this one passage that I'm going to read is really powerful in regards to Claire and Claire's husband. So we start with, and there's a really good twist at the end of the book that leaves the reader questioning how the book actually ends, and I appreciate that. So I'm not going to spoil the ending of the book for you, but I think that it's actually a really interesting twist as I think about Claire and Irene's motivations throughout the entire book. So Irene is having lunch in Chicago. Irene is having lunch in New York. She's from Chicago, but she's having lunch in New York, and she goes to a restaurant. She's passing when she goes to this restaurant. It's primarily a restaurant for white folks, and she goes to this restaurant. She feels a white woman come in, and she sort of watches the white woman, and then she feels like as she's eating, the entire time she's eating and drinking tea, this white woman is staring at her. And so one thing that I highlighted is, could that woman somehow know that here before her very eyes on the roof of the Drayton sat a Negro? And I thought that that was really interesting because it highlights Irene's anxiety about being clocked as not being Negro, and come to find out that it's actually her friend Claire, and they grew up together. She just didn't recognize Claire in particular because Claire had gone to even further extremes to pass within this community. But I think that there's a really interesting piece here about the white gaze and the ways in which we identify each other in our own communities, but also the ways in which we know that white folks will stare at us, trying to put us into a place or a category as we think about race. And then it goes on, nevertheless, Irene felt in turn anger, scorn, and fear slide over her. It wasn't that she was ashamed of being a Negro or even having it declared. It was the idea of being ejected from any place, even in the polite and tactful way in which the Drayton would probably do it, that disturbed her. So again, she's not necessarily worried, even though she's attempting to pass in this part of the book, she's not necessarily worried about being outed as being black, but she is concerned about having to be ejected and what that looks like. And I think that I know that I've had that fear myself growing up, right? And I grew up in the 80s and 90s, so I wasn't necessarily fearful that I was going to be ejected from anywhere, but I certainly had fear about driving through sundown towns at night, fearing for my safety. I grew up in a small community where I was the victim of racial violence, not against me, but against our property. And so fear for those things and what that means, even though I wasn't ashamed to be black. And then she goes on. So then she finds out that the woman that's been staring at her and causing this anxiety is her friend Claire, who they've known each other for a very long time, like I said. And they get together and they talk about what it means to pass, and Claire saying, that she's passed and she's married to a white man who doesn't know. And so that prompts curiosity from Irene, and Irene says the truth was she was curious. There were things she wanted to ask Claire Kendry. She wished to find out about this hazardous business of passing, this breaking away from all that was familiar and friendly to take a chance in another environment. Not entirely strange, perhaps, but certainly not entirely friendly. What, for example, one did about background, how one accounted for oneself, and how one felt when one came into contact with other Negroes. But she couldn't. She wasn't able to think of a single question that in its context or phrasing was appropriate to ask. I think this is also a really interesting way to think about I process this as, again, this is not how Nella Larsen means this passage, but I process this in particular how people of color show up in white spaces, and I always have questions in particular for other black folks, like how do you show up? What things do you share about yourself? Are you candid? Do you code switch? Do you change your tone? And I think that we all have to do that. That's a mechanism of survival that we have to do. But those are questions that I generally want to ask other people of color, in particular where we're in white spaces, and when we're in white spaces that we are not sure if they will be affirming, right? So I generally can know I'm going to walk into this white space. It will be mostly affirming of who I am as a black woman. But if I am ever unsure of that, I immediately code switch, and I do that for my own fear and safety. But I also think being socialized white, it's something that I do because it's just default, and I was socialized to do it, and I can, as a biracial person, for me, that is a thing that I can easily snap into, is that code switch and going back to that socialization as white. My laptop. Apologies. Now I can't put my password in and my notes closed. Awkward. And so the passage that I want to read that was particularly striking. Oh yay, someone likes Nella Larsen. Look, y'all, I came outside because it's a gorgeous day, but now I can't see my mouse and I can't scroll down to find my notes. You're gonna look at the sky for just a second while I try and get my mouse into the right place. Sorry for the awkwardness that is me, and trying to manage technology today. Gonna walk back in the house so that I can actually see and scroll down. We're in my garage. Hello, garage. And it's a mess because if you haven't heard, I am leaving KU, and this is one of the last things that I get to do. So grateful this is one of the last things that I get to do when my garage is a mess. There are a lot of passages that I highlight, but I want to get to, they spend some time talking about, their children and concern about how dark their children might be, in particular if they're passing, which just reminds me of the conversation that Harry and Meghan just had with Oprah about the conversation about how dark Archie might be, and that's completely appalling, a disgusting conversation. And how sad is it that you've got to move to the United States to escape racism from England? So that's a whole nother story, not for today. All right, I think I found the place that I want to be in. Just needed to get out of the sun for a second so I could actually read my notes. Okay, so Claire and another friend who also has been passing, Claire invites Irene and that friend over for tea or lunch, and Claire's husband comes home. And so, again, the husband doesn't know, and this puts both Irene and the other friend in danger, because there are all these black women sitting in this white man's apartment, and he does not know that he's surrounded by black women. He thinks they are all white women. And so there's this passage. And so again, content warning that this includes racial slurs. So Irene is saying, in Claire's eyes, as she presented her husband, was a queer gleam, a jeer it might be. Irene couldn't define it. The mechanical professions that attended an introduction over, she inquired, meaning Claire, inquired, did you hear what Jack called me? Jack is Claire's husband. Yes, Gertrude answered, laughing with a delightful eagerness. Irene didn't speak. Her gaze remained on Claire's smiling face. The black lids fluttered down. Tell them, dear, why you call me that. Where are my high notes? Where are my notes? So I used Audible. I read the book, not on Audible. I read the book on Amazon, Kindle, and now my notes aren't showing up, and so this is really sad. But essentially, I'm not going to do Nello Larsen any good here. His nickname for, Jack's nickname for his wife Claire is Nig, and it's short for nigger. This is appalling to Irene, who immediately feels herself to be in danger. And Jack says he calls her this because she gets darker skinned in the summer. She gets a tan. And through this whole passage and this exchange back and forth, Claire or Irene decides to ask, like, do you not like black folks? Like, why the nickname? And Jack is like, no. He's like, niggers are just filthy animals, and I don't trust the lot of them, and all of this thing. And the whole time, Irene is sitting there confused and feeling unsafe because, again, all three of them are black women with this white man who doesn't know he's surrounded by black women. And she's really angry at Claire for putting her in this position. And Gertrude is just simply trying to be polite and doesn't know what to do. But all three black women are passing in this white man's home. And time passes, and eventually they leave. And when Irene and Claire leave, when Irene and Gertrude leave, they both talk about it, and Gertrude tries to find humor in the situation because she understands what it means to try to pass, but Irene doesn't, and she's very irate at Claire, and spends 2 years ignoring Claire's attempts to get back in contact with her. And I see someone ask what year it was written, and I'm pretty sure it was written in 1923. That's the year that's sticking in my head. And so she spends 2 years Irene spends 2 years avoiding Claire, and at that point Claire just shows up at her house, which Irene finds to be very rude. And Claire's like, look, I really just want to connect back to the black community. I've been missing that. I feel like part of me is missing. And so reluctantly and hesitantly, Irene lets her move in for some reason, even though Claire's not estranged from her husband. I think he's traveling for business, like overseas. Irene lets Claire move in with her. And this is where the book goes a little wonky, that I don't love it. Irene thinks that Claire and her husband are having an affair, and she starts to get jealous. And then she thinks about, maybe I'll tell Irene's husband about her being black. But ultimately she decides she can't do that. She's not going to turn in her fellow sister in that way. And so she decides not to do that. But one day while she's walking, it's been probably 6 months, she's walking outside with a visibly black friend, and they're holding arms. They bump into Jack, Claire's husband. And in that moment, Jack recognizes, oh, Irene is black because she's with this black person. She's been passing. And then Irene just ignores him and tries to pretend that she doesn't know who he is. But he gets it. He clues in. He finds out where Irene lives. He shows up. He confronts Claire, and he's like, you're a nigger. Like, what have you been doing? What's going on? What is this life? And then a thing happens in the book, and I don't want to ruin it if you intend to read the book, so I don't want to ruin what happens next. And I have my own thoughts on what actually happens in the book, because the author leaves it for you to sort of figure out, like, what did happen in the book? What do you think happened? What is your perspective of what happens next? And so I have my perspective of what I think happens next, but if you're the lucky person who gets a copy of the book, I don't want to ruin it for you. And I'd say it's worth reading. As I started this video off saying, I don't love this book as much as I thought I did, but it's a good book, and it's really well written for the time. And Nella Larsen is such a great author. I think it's worth picking up and giving it a read. It's a very short read. I think it's, like I said, I have read it both times on my Kindle, but it's a short read. I think it's like 3 sections with like 2 to 3 chapters each. It's probably less than 150 pages, this book. It's very short. You can also Google passing and read a synopsis online. You miss some really great nuanced conversational pieces around race and passing and what passing means. But for me, as I think about the context of what the author meant, is the book is situated in the 20s, when I think a lot of folks are trying to pass. We see the creation of societies. We see the creation of the brown bag test. When being light-skinned is valued, it's still valued today, right, to be light-skinned. But we see what that means and what that looks like. And to think about the context of which this book is written in the 20s, and it's set in the 20s, what the author meant and how the context of that time, that conversation is really crucial. I think it's very crucial today, but I think it's just set differently in what it means in the 20s is black folks are gaining some sort of hold or recognition and in particular in the larger cities. This book is set in Chicago and New York, what that looks like. And there's actually some really great passages on them being in New York City, and conversations about Harlem and how white folks are invading Harlem, because one of the friends asked, like, wouldn't you be afraid to be seen as a white person, to Claire, as a white person, to be seen in Harlem? And Irene's like, oh no, like, lots of white people go to Harlem these days. It's the thing to do. It's the cool thing to do. So even then, white folks are trying to capitalize on what black people are doing and what black culture is. And then there's a white author who writes about, in the book, there's a white male author who writes about race, and even then his conversations, and they're a little triggering actually, his conversations with both Irene and Claire as he discusses racial matters with them in Harlem. So there's some really great nuanced conversations about race in the book that it's definitely worth a read. If you've not read it, it's worth a read, and like I said, it's a short read. And it's really great, I think, in particular for the last 10 pages as we explore what happened, and the motivations as to why they happened. Because I think it leaves the book open to a lot of really great self-definition around race and female friendships and what happens in the last few pages of the book. So that is a brief synopsis of Passing by Nella Larsen, the book that I chose for this. And I chose the book with a one-word title, Looking Back. I live right off 23rd, so it can be really noisy sometimes. Sorry, y'all. I chose Passing, like I said, because I had read the book, and I think Nella Larsen is such a brilliant author. Had I chose a different book with one-word title, it would have been Allegedly by Tiffany D. Jackson. Really great book. Don't want to spoil that one at all, but and content warning, it's about a child placed in foster home and dealing with some abuse issues, but it's actually brilliantly written. And Tiffany D. Jackson, brilliant black woman author, so I would highly pick. I've read everything she's written, so if you want to read anything by Tiffany D. Jackson, I would highly recommend picking that up. But that is it for me, y'all. I so appreciate the space and the opportunity to do this. Again, thank you to Meg Williams, Boulon Remise, and the Emily Taylor Center for creating this series and this space for black women and femme folks to talk about books by black women. It's such an important topic. And I spent a year, I read a lot, and so I spent a year challenging myself to read books just by women of color. And your whole mind set shifts as you read books and really start to be in that space where you're reading from that perspective and considering books from that perspective. So if it's a challenge that you'd like to give to yourself, I'd say read any of the books that are featured in the series, and or create your own reading list. I'm on Goodreads, so if you want to follow me on Goodreads and read, find my book list of women of color authors. There are some really great reads in there. I'm always happy to provide some recommendations as well, in particular Tiffany D. Jackson. She's brilliant. She writes fiction, contemporary fiction, so it's really good stuff there. But again, thank you for this opportunity, and I hope that y'all go out and enjoy the sunshine today. And thanks so much. Rock Talk.